This is Crusher Crossing, a man who built an empire before he could even drive. He sold out the Inuka Armory, conquered cable TV, and became a legend of the NWF. But every legend has a dark story to tell. I caught up with Crusher Crossing just as he was going into his retirement match. On episode 2 of Indie Wrestling Uncut, we are not talking about the glory. Today, we're talking about the steroids, stolen rings, and the blood.
And I'm Crusher Crossing, founder of the NWF. I'm here in Northern Ireland, training for my final retirement match, and I guess there's no better time than to talk about the dark side of the NWF.
Crusher Crossing, 5-time NWF World Champion. Nobody knows the dark side of the ring, and the dark side of being a promoter more than you do. You've been through lying from wrestlers, you've been through money problems, and you've had the downfall and the rise. You know more than most promoters, have much more experience than most of them. So, and even in the book and documentary, you didn't share everything. So tell me, why are you sharing the dark side of the ring with me here on your retirement match?
These stories were never really told, so I'm thinking that, other than maybe me and Dave talk about it sometimes on our podcast, but for the most part, people have never heard these stories. So I think maybe it's time that people maybe hear this other side of the NWF that they never really knew about, that was always there. And there were reasons why I didn't share some of these stories in my book and documentary.
Crusher has told his story many times in books and documentaries, but he's always kept his darkest stories hidden. To understand why these secrets matter, you need to understand what the NWF was. The NWF wasn't just a hobby, it was a powerhouse.
It was a kids-based wrestling promotion in the beginning that started with me and my friend Charlie Lane. And we were just diehard wrestling fans, and we had no other avenue to go to do it, so we created our own. And that's what the NWF was in the beginning. But then in time, we grew into and transitioned into an actual indie federation. But indie wrestling is what it became. So it started out as kids, but then it ended up with indie wrestling. So yeah, because once we started doing the cable show, and we kept doing it was really the cable show that kept it going every week. And then as we got it bigger and bigger, and we started doing live events, that's when light bulb all went off that we can make this more of an actual wrestling federation. Back in the 80s, that wasn't a hard thing. It was just you had to know how to do it. And not everybody knew how to do that. Here everybody in our community had the ability to make their own television shows and put it on cable. But I would say 95% of the people didn't know that that was an option. It was just not something that was advertised, that you could do this. So luckily I knew about it, and so I got involved. So the cable TV part wasn't hard. The hard part was getting it to all the different stations and syndicating it and getting it to all the other states. That was just a lot of work, getting it all set up, that most people wouldn't do. Most people would produce their shows in their own community, and that's how farther they would go. I wanted to go everywhere with it.
While Crusher was in the studio every week, grinding to keep the NWF on television, cable TV worker Scott Johnson always had to make Crusher's job 10 times harder.
Yeah, the hard part there was, while a lot of the people that worked at the cable company were really admiring what I was doing at a young age, because I was only 16 at the time when I really got going with it. I mean, I started when I was 14, but 16 when things were really moving along. But not everybody at the cable company were fans of it either, And Scott Johnson being one of them, he was not a wrestling fan, and B wasn't a fan of kids doing it. So he just looked at it like kids clowning around, using the equipment for their own silly things, the silly wrestling or whatever, how he described it, because that's the way he looked at it. So when you got somebody like that, he's not a fan, well, he's going to go out of his way to try to get us out of his way. He didn't want us in the studio, so he'd do whatever he could to get us out. Everybody felt the same about Scott Johnson. Like, all the guys seen the same thing I seen. So it's just like, all you would do is just, he'd come in and he'd make a big fuss about what we were doing if we were getting too loud or whatever in our interviews. We'd do interview sessions where we just do all our interviews in the studio. And sometimes the wrestlers are yelling and getting into their character. And Scott would yell at us for it. And the guys, we'd just be like, okay, keep it down. And we all just, when he left the room, we just bitch about it, like, yeah, there's Scott Johnson again, interfering once again. And everybody looked at it the same, like, this guy just doesn't like us. We all had the same kind of vision of him. You have a 3-hour block. So this is the hard part as any promoter or anything. When you go to a cable company or a television studio, you have a 3-hour window and you have to get everything done in 3 hours. So usually we would do 2 1-hour shows. So that gives us an hour to both set up and tear down and go nonstop. So there's like, when we start recording the show, we just go nonstop. Interviews, everything. It just goes boom, 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 boom. And we're trying to get the show done. And sometimes you run a little bit over. And it was a Saturday, there's nobody in after us, so I knew that block wasn't reserved again. So we're all done, our window was up, but again, nobody's coming in after us. And so I was in the control room directing, I think Mike was on camera, and we're wrapping the show up. And Scott knows this, that we're finishing the show up. He knows how production works. He's not, but what does he do? He decides to shut the lights off. It was his way of telling us we're done. So he just starts shutting the studio lights off, and all I've seen is the studio going dark. And I'm asking Mike, what the hell is going on? And he whispers under his thing, Transit just came in and started shutting the lights off. And I remember going in and saying, Scott, really? And he's like, your window's up, you're done, pack it up and go.
But the drama wasn't just about people like Scott Tronson. There was a different kind of darkness creeping in. It was the stress of the hustle. Before the cameras rolled, Crusher was carrying a weight most teenagers couldn't even imagine. The fear of losing everything before the first bell even rang.
The stress came in, are we going to sell enough tickets to cover the cost? That was always the stress. Because the Armory costs money. And everything, so the Armory had it was like $400 we always had to come up with just to cover the expense of the Armory. And so when you're selling tickets at $250 or $350, $450 a seat, you got to sell hundreds of tickets in order to cover the costs. And so it was always a gamble, if we're going to get enough. So the stress was so I was always pushing ticket sales with the wrestlers. Make sure you sell the tickets, sell your advance tickets. It all helps. And I'd always have to push them. And there was no online kind of venture to sell tickets. We had to either sell them in advance at the banks. The Northern Bank usually sold their tickets for us in advance, or we had the wrestlers sell them door to door, just friends and neighbors. And so that was a stress. Now the thing is, I was also a wrestler, and so it was always exciting to know that we're going to go out in front of people and we're going to do this show. So that counterbalanced the stress for me. But all the other kids didn't have that same stress. I carried all that stress. And that's where that's why I can relate to indie promoters today, because I know exactly what they're going through when it comes to that stress. And there's also other stresses involved besides ticket sales. We had to get sponsors. We had to go to businesses and ask them, will you sponsor us for this event? Because that's how I did it. Because ticket sales weren't enough. If you do the math, at $3 or $2 a ticket, there's not enough. You need more money still. So I'd have to go get sponsorships, get businesses to sponsor us, where they would just get their business card and our program guide that we'd make, and then they would give us X amount of dollars, and I'd get a number of sponsors. And I go to all the businesses in Anoka, and most businesses said no, not interested. You'd think a little kid or 13 teenager going in there asking to sponsor, you'd think they would. No. But the banks and the car dealerships, they all did. So I quickly learned what businesses to hit up. So I'd get every bank in town, every car dealership, and I don't care if the program guide was filled with all the banks. That's what it takes. That's what it takes when we get the sponsorships.
In the indie wrestling business, the biggest enemy isn't the guy in the ring, it's the logistics. Today's promoters struggle with no shows and broken down rings. And back then, it was no different. Crusher had a 20-foot ring and a dream, but he didn't have a driver's license. It was a constant scramble just to keep the show on the road.
There's always ups and downs, like where can we set the ring up to do a show, because we didn't always have locations to do shows, which is why some of our shows were done in a backyard. We had a few tapings were in the backyard. Now today people look at it and say, well, you're just doing backyard wrestling, but that's not how we looked at it. We just looked at it as a nice sunny day and this is a perfect place to tape the show. Nobody thought of backyard wrestling wasn't a thing. That wasn't even a concept. So it was just a nice sunny day and it was a perfect way to do a show. But that was stressful because if we didn't have a place to get the ring, transporting the ring, rings are heavy. They take a trailer or a truck or something. I didn't even drive. So I have this wrestling ring. I'd always have to find somebody that could transport it for me with either a truck or a trailer. And not everybody had come through with that. Steve Engstrom, for example, would be the one I'd go to for this because he could drive, but I remember the day we got the ring, Steve was supposed to come with me, and I set up with my neighbor. He had a big trailer that I could borrow, but I needed Steve to drive. And he tells me the day of he can't do it. So now what do? I got to go all the way out, an hour out of town to Hutchinson to pick up our wrestling ring that we just got. We just purchased it. A real wrestling ring, a full 20-foot ring. So I had to quickly scramble to figure out another ride to get the trailer to get out there and get it, which I did. So that's all stress.
Every independent wrestling promoter learns a hard lesson. The dangerous part about the business isn't what happens in the ring, it's the dark shadows outside of it. For Crusher, the dark side started when people he relied on disappeared, and the first betrayal would leave a mark that changed everything.
In the indie business, Steve Engstrom came in and I totally trusted him. He was almost like a brother to me. I have that kind of relationship. But then he did a 180 and just turned his back and really backstabbed me. And that's when I learned that the people that you could think you could be the closest to could be the ones that are the furthest apart from you. And people will, you find out who your true friends are and who are not your true friends, and that was an example with Steve Engstrom. So, and Steve, it all came out in 1987 when he went with Larry, and the two of them decided they're going to take our wrestling ring and all the money that we generated from that particular Armory card that I promoted. They took all the money and they took the ring and they left, and that was and why I didn't see that coming, I don't know, because this is kind of brewing for a while with them too, and I should have seen it, but I didn't. But I seen it then. I mean, it was just sheer betrayal. That's the definition of betrayal with what they did. And at first I was angry. I was just furious. And the first thing I did when that happened is I called Steve Engstrom. I called Steve. I said, Steve, what the hell's going on here? And Steve just played stupid with me. He's like, I don't know what's going on. I have to talk to Larry. That's all Larry. I have nothing to do with it. I don't know. I said, Steve, don't bullshit me. I want to know what's going on. Why'd you take the money? Where's the money? Where's the ring? Because I got to talk to Larry. Larry's got it all. Steve wouldn't, he just played stupid. But to me, Steve knew everything just as much as Larry. I knew it, as far as I'm concerned, but and that's when I realized that this guy I thought was my friend, who I thought I could trust forever, I can't trust.
Steve was playing the fool, acting like he was just a passenger in this chaos. But Crusher knew better as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The trail of the missing money and the stolen ring didn't lead back just to Steve alone. It led to a mastermind, a man who was truly pulling the strings in the shadows, Luscious Larry.
That's what we'd call a ringleader. A ringleader is somebody who's the one that really is the culprit. Larry was the ringleader of all this. And I knew that much because when Steve was telling me to go to Larry, that's Steve's way of saying that Larry's the one that was telling him what to do. So, which is probably the case. Steve was just playing stupid with me, but he probably knew. But anyways, Larry, in Larry's mind, he wanted to take over our creation and our league and morph it into just him and his guys and all the older guys with all of us teenagers to be left behind.
Larry and Steve had the ring, they had the money, and now they even have a new promotion, the NCWA. They thought they could flip a switch and steal Crusher's success, but they forgot one thing. You may be able to steal the ring, but you cannot steal the grind. While they tried to play a promoter in a local bar, Crusher proved that you don't need a massive ring to draw a massive crowd.
Initially, what Larry wanted to do is he wanted to break away from the NWF, co-promote with us with NCWA, which would be their league, and Steve would be with Larry, and they would be in the NCWA, and then we'd be the NWF. We'd still do shows together. That was the plan. But we'd be two different leagues. And then what they did is they took the ring and the money and everything. That was their way of trying to just take it all and then leave us behind. The only time it really came up that we were going against them was once I got the ring back, because they had to return the ring to me. I don't know if I've ever told this story. I think I did in the book and documentary, but I had the ring serialized with the police department, but Steve and Larry didn't know I did that. So every piece of steel had a serial number on it, and that's how I got the ring back. Because the police went out there and verified it, and they had to return the ring. So I got my ring back, and then they built another ring, and then they started doing their own thing with NCWA. Here's the problem though. Larry, who was running the NCWA, and Steve, they were not leaders at all. They didn't know how to do it. They had no clue what they were doing when it came to promoting. They thought they could figure it out and do it. And then the only time we went against them was at the August Armory Card when I decided to do another Armory show. And we did it in August. We did the Anoka Armory the night the NWA came to town, which was bad timing. I didn't know they were coming to town that night. And we had 70 people still show up to our show. They did a show earlier in the afternoon at a local bar across town, and about 10 people showed up. That's what I'm trying to say. Larry didn't know how to promote. And if you don't know what you're doing promoting-wise, that's what happens. You don't get anybody. And Larry thought that he was such a big attraction because of all the big crowds I would get with him on our show. He thought he could do it himself. But it's not just because it's, just because you're a big guy and big muscular guy and you might be over with the crowd. If you don't know how to promote yourself, and he didn't, that's what happens. 10 people show up, and that's what it was. 10 people.
Success has a way of feeding the ego. Larry's attitude began to shift. He wasn't just a guest anymore, he wanted to be the boss. But behind the screaming and backstage power plays was a dark secret Crusher wouldn't understand until years later. A transformation fueled by steroids.
At first, Larry listened. In the beginning, Larry listened to everything I said. The first thing Larry said to me when Steve asked me if we can bring Larry in to do this match, I said, I like the idea. I think we can do that. I looked at it like he's going to be an outsider coming in to take care of Steve, who's too big to be in our show to begin with. It was a really good angle. And that's how we did it. But Larry wanted to immediately do an exhibition match with Mr. X and everything. And I said, no, you're not going to do anything. You're just going to be there, pose and everything, and that's it. And if they want to see you wrestling, they're going to have to buy a ticket to see it. I stole that from the AWA because that's what Vern did with Andre the Giant. You never got to see him wrestle when he came. They only showed the poster of him. So I did the same concept with Larry. And that's how we sold out the Armory, because they had to come and pay the money to see him. So anyways, he listened to me. But then what happened is, then when he's seen these big crowds and that, and he started thinking that he knew better, and then I seen it first in Brooklyn Park, he was starting to yell at everybody, telling everybody what to do when we were setting up. I'm running the show, it's my card, and he's yelling at me and everybody else, and I went to Steve, I said, Steve, why the hell is he yelling and barking orders? He's not in charge here. And Steve said, I know, just calm down, he's worried, he wants it to go good. And right then and there, I knew there was something wrong with him because his anger, he's just angry. He's just yelling and stuff. And I'm like, why? Well, years later, I realized it was the steroids. Larry was a big muscular guy and he was on steroids, but I didn't know how steroids worked at that time. But I do now, and now that I look back, that was the anger management issues was from the steroids.
But it wasn't just a locker room that was getting dangerous in the 1980s. Blood was the ultimate currency in wrestling. They called it getting colour. Everyone wanted to do it, and at 18 years old, Crusher Crossing was no different. A small trick to entertain the crowd turned into a bloody disaster that nearly cost Crusher Crossing everything.
Well, actually, so I didn't write about it in my book or documentary. At the blading, I actually did in the NWF. But it was when I sold it. I had already sold the league to Ernie Ellis. And I was 18 and I was able to do it. Now, blading or juicing, as they called it back then, is just where you take a razor blade and you cut yourself, and that's how blood is done in the wrestling business. Unless it's an accident. Like sometimes accidents happen and they start bleeding. But for the most part, if you were gonna have color, is what we called it, meaning blood, you would cut yourself. And it was a kind of a fad almost. Everybody wanted to do it. So when I was 18, of course I did too. It was like, that was the thing. Now people are gonna look at that and think, well, why would kids or anybody want to bleed? because that's how wrestling was in the 80s. It was a color thing. He's busted open, he got busted open. That was a cool thing to see in the wrestling matches, all of us, everybody. So to have blood was a kind of a neat thing. So for me to be able to cut myself and do this, that's what I wanted to do, because it was like a fad in the business of wrestling. So the only thing is, we didn't have anybody to smarten us up on how to do it. We knew we were supposed to use surgical razor blades, which are real flimsy if you've ever seen these, and they're sharp as heck, and you have to cut them up just so it's just a little bit. We do all that, but I got so excited I pressed too hard, and I literally cut my forehead open, and there was blood everywhere. And when I got to the back and I went to the mirror and I looked in the mirror, it looked like I had a mouth on my forehead. The skin was just separated. I had cut through all the layers. I didn't just lightly cut like you're supposed to. I cut through several layers all the way to the bone. And Jeff Dinsmore, who was the acting promoter at the time in the dry dock, come in, he looked at me and he's seen it and he just goes, "You effing idiot." Because he was right. I was an idiot. And I had to go to the doctor and get stitches and missed the second taping. It was just a disaster.
In August of 1987, Crusher Crossing sold the league at 17 to Ernie Ellis, in hopes for the league to reach new heights. They were one signature away from a massive cable TV deal, a move that would have changed everything. But the deal was blown and the fun died. The original NWF superstars were being turned into jobbers.
When I sold the league to Ernie Ellis, and basically selling the league is basically selling the ring, because the ring is the league. Whoever owns the ring owns the league. And Ernie offered to buy it, and he had the means to transport it around where I didn't. I knew it would be in better hands with him, but I wanted it to remain NWF. I had all sorts of stipulations. We drew up a contract and everything. But I was going to stay in charge of the television side of the production. Ernie would just run the promoting. And then I would also work with new wrestlers coming in, because they were bringing all sorts of new guys in. And we didn't have formal training, but we needed to smarten them up enough so they could get in there and start working matches. And then the rest of that would come from matches. You would learn as you go. That's how it was done. And very few were like Eddie Sharkey, where he'd actually train. But even then, you're still thrown into matches while you're training. That's how it was done back in those days. And a lot of your training would come from the match itself on shows. You'd just be put in with somebody who knew what they were doing. And we did the same. So the frustration came when Ernie, who now is in charge, and I'm only in charge of the television part of it, making sure that's all done, Ernie would start making decisions that I just knew were the wrong decisions. But I can't control it now, because I'm now just wrestling and doing the television. And I remember one thing came up with local origination. We were about to go from community television to the local side, where you can then get ad revenue. You could have commercials and stuff and actually get paid from the cable company to produce the show. But we'd lose our normal volunteer crew, which is Greg Bushman and Scott Dotzer. They're my guys, but they're good guys. But we'd have to get rid of them, because we'd be using the LO crew. And I had it all set up to do this, where we were going to shift over to this, and we'd actually get revenue coming in, money for the first time, money coming in from the cable. And then Ernie, at the 11th hour, decided, nope, we're not going to do it, because I don't want to let these guys in the dark. Ernie was good-hearted that way, and I get it, but still, it was the wrong decision. We could have grew with the league. Who knows where we would have grew with it if we would have went down that road? Because that was like, it wasn't common for LO to come to you and say, we want to produce you guys. You know, that was like a gift to get that opportunity, and Ernie blew it. It was a hard decision, because I know a lot of the guys never trusted those guys. Even though it was Larry was the culprit, these other adults that were involved, but they were better. Like Ernie was and Jeff Dinsmore, those guys they were better guys. Like, they weren't like Larry. But still, a lot of the kids and the teens, they didn't trust any of them. It's like when Steve and Larry did their thing, they looked at all of them the same. So they just didn't trust them. And they weren't thinking it was the right decision to be made. So I had to struggle with how they felt. And then that's why in the contract I had in there, when we drew up a contract when I sold the league, I specifically stated they had to keep the teens on. They can't just get rid of them. So they didn't. But what happened is they eventually, all the teams just said, this isn't, I don't like the way this is going, and they just kind of fell off the bandwagon. They just decided not to do it because they didn't like the way they were going with it, the direction. Because they were putting a lot of the kids and the teens in like squash match positions. It wasn't fun. If you're not going to make it fun. See, that's what they did. They, in a way, Ernie just kind of made it where it wasn't fun for them. And if you take away the fun side of it, why would they want to keep doing it? If they're just going to keep losing matches over and over and over, which is what was happening with a lot of them.
The NWF started with a bed mattress and a few kids who just wanted to prove that they can do it. It's easy to look at professional wrestling and only see the matches, but the real story is about the people who built the foundation. This era of the NWF was about passion before it became a business. It's a piece of Minnesota history that deserves to be remembered exactly as it was. Thank you for watching. This has been Indie Wrestling Uncut.